So along with sine and cosine, we have 4 other trig functions. So these are our other trigonometric functions. We're going to define them in terms of sine and cosine, but then we're also going to define them in terms of sides of a right triangle. So we'll go ahead and get our right triangle out here. Here's my angle, here's my C, here's my A, here's my B. In relation to this angle, the side that's opposite is A, and the side that's adjacent is B. And this would be my hypotenuse. So the side that's the longest is always your hypotenuse. So the trig functions that we know are sine. So we know that sine of an angle is opposite over hypotenuse, in this case A over C. So we've done that one. We've also done cosine. So we know that cosine of an angle is adjacent over hypotenuse, in this case B over C. The third trig function is tangent. So what is tangent? Tangent of an angle, in terms of sine and cosine, is sine of that angle divided by cosine of that angle. So you can either think of it in terms of sine and cosine, or you can think of it in terms of this right triangle. And the right triangle is going to be opposite over adjacent, which is A over B. The sine over cosine is probably the more common way to think about it. So tangent of an angle, find the sine of the angle, find the cosine of the angle, divide the two. Next, we can have the secant. Secant of an angle. You would think this would match up with sine, but it does not. This matches up with cosine. So secant of an angle is 1 over cosine of that angle. So it's the reciprocal of the cosine. So if I come up here and write down the reciprocal of the cosine, I get hypotenuse over adjacent, which is C over B. So if you know cosine, you can figure out secant just by finding the reciprocal. Next I have cosecant. You would think cosecant would match up with cosine because they both start with co, but that's not true. Cosecant of an angle is 1 over sine of that angle. Just like secant was the reciprocal of cosine, cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So the reciprocal of sine is hypotenuse over opposite, which is C over A. So if you know sine of an angle, you can figure out cosecant of an angle just by flipping the fraction. And then lastly I have cotangent. So cotangent of an angle matches up with tangent, so I take the reciprocal of tangent, so 1 divided by tangent of theta, which is going to be adjacent over opposite, which is B over A. So if you can find tangent, you can also find cotangent just by flipping the fraction. Really, if you can find these first 3, finding the next 3 are pretty easy. You just flip the fraction. In fact, if you can just find the sine and cosine, you can find tangent just by dividing the two. So tangent is sine divided by cosine. And we'll do some examples of this. So example 1, let's let theta be 2 pi over 3. And let's find the values of the 6 trig functions. So find the values of the 6 trig functions. First I'm going to find is sine. So sine of 2 pi over 3. Sine and cosine are definitely the most basic ones. So let's find sine of 2 pi over 3. To do that, go back to my unit circle. 2 pi over 3, that says move 2 pi over 3 in the positive direction. So I'll move to this point. And now sine is my y-coordinate. The y-coordinate here is square root of 3 over 2. So sine of 2 pi over 3 is the square root of 3 over 2. Next, I'll do cosine of 2 pi over 3. Again, come back to my unit circle. So the cosine of 2 pi over 3, and looking at the same point, is the x-coordinate, so negative 1/2. Now once I find sine and cosine, I can find the rest of them just by using what I know. So the tangent of 2 pi over 3, that's going to be sine divided by cosine. So that's square root of 3 over 2 divided by negative 1/2. If I write this out, this would be square root of 3 over 2 times negative 2, because dividing by negative 1/2 is the same as multiplying by negative 2, which is negative square root of 3. So now I have sine, cosine, tangent. Next, let's find secant. So to find secant, that's with the reciprocal of cosine. So cosine here is negative 1/2, so the reciprocal would be negative 2. Next, let's find cosecant. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So sine was square root of 3 over 2. Take the reciprocal, 2 over square root of 3. And lastly, cotangent of 2 pi over 3. That's the reciprocal of tangent. Tangent's negative square root of 3, so the reciprocal would be negative 1 square root of 3. So once you find the sine and cosine, you can find the rest of them just by knowing their relationships. Let's do one more of these. So this is example 2. This time, let's let theta be negative pi over 6, and let's find the values of the 6 functions, so the 6 trig functions. First one I'm going to do is sine, so sine of negative pi over 6, and also cosine of negative pi over 6. I'm going to do those together since they're both coming from the unit circle. So let's go back to my unit circle. Pi over 6 is kind of one notch away from the positive x-axis. So if I'm going negative pi over 6, that would be the same as 2 pi minus pi over 6. So that's going to bring me down here to 11 pi over 6. So the x-coordinate is square root of 3 over 2. That's corresponding to cosine. And my y-coordinate is negative 1/2. That's corresponding to sine. Okay, so I have those two. From those I can find the rest. So tangent of negative pi over 6, that's going to be sine divided by cosine, so negative 1/2 divided by square root of 3 over 2. That's negative 1/2 times 2 over square root of 3. So when you divide by a fraction, you flip it over and multiply straight across. Well, the 2's will cancel, so I get negative 1 over square root of 3. 4, let's find the secant of negative pi over 6. Remember, secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so I take my cosine and flip it. So I get 2 over square root of 3. Next, let's do cosecant of negative pi over 6. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, so the reciprocal of negative 1/2 is negative 2. You could say negative 2 over 1, but that's just negative 2. And then lastly, cotangent of negative pi over 6 is the reciprocal of tangent, so the reciprocal of negative 1 over square root of 3 would be negative square root of 3. Again, it could be negative square root over 1, but that's just negative square root of 3. So if you know sine and cosine, you can figure out the other 4 just by using the relations.